This is United States History 202, Presentation 11, United States Imperialism, 1865 to 1917. So essentially what we're going to do now is concentrate solely on American foreign policy from 1865 to 1917 and look at the expansionistic policies of the United States and how that's going to be classified as imperialism, which under a definition that I give you, it definitely is. And then we'll talk about some of the other things that are going on. Of course, the granddaddy of all American involvement in this period is going to be World War I, which I cover in Presentation 13 for the next quiz. So we're going to look at all the other things that are going on here. And this is definitely a component of progressivism because this idea of progress is going to drive people to expand. And I'll go into more detail about that. So, is the United States imperialist? Well, imperialism is the policy of extending the rule or authority of an empire or a nation over foreign territory, or of acquiring and holding colonies and dependencies. Or it could be a policy of extending a country's power and influence through diplomacy or military force. Under those definitions, the United States is an empire, even to this day. This process begins at the end of the war between the states, and then will really take off in the late 19th and early 20th century. Now, the traditional United States foreign policy, as suggested by George Washington and other members of the founding generation, rejected this idea of an aggressive, interfering United States. Now, some people would say it's because the United States is weak, they didn't want to expand, or they didn't want to be involved in Europe. Certainly, but I think the overarching goal was to be a peaceful trading partner in avoiding war at all costs, because wars are expensive, wars tend to create centralization, wars tend to create problems. So you only fight a war if you have to. You don't fight a war because you want to. And you don't fight a war because of your meddling in other places, which causes war. Of course, the United States expansion before 1865 involved acquiring land in North America, and in some cases was aggressive. If you look at, for example, Mexico in the war with Mexico between 1846 and 1848. But there were those who rejected this process for a variety of reasons, some because they thought the executive was becoming too powerful, others because they said it was too expensive, etc., etc. Now, the United States is going to change course following the Civil War. Essentially what they do is they say, okay, now we're going to export liberty and democracy. We've transformed the South, we're transforming the West. Now we're going to try to export this idea to other parts of the world as well. So you're going to take our liberty and democracy and you're going to like it. And essentially this is what happens in the 19th and early 20th centuries for the United States. So the major issues we're going to talk about in this presentation: the motivating factors behind imperialism, the territory that's acquired, the United States is a growing world power, and of course we'll look at the anti-imperialists in a little bit of detail. Now, reasons for American imperialism. Well, military. We need to showcase our military power. We need bases, mostly naval bases. There are economic reasons. We need outlets for both manufactured goods and raw materials. And there are intellectual reasons: race, religion, science, world power. And we'll get into all these things in a little more detail. So let's start with the rush for colonies and look at the map here. You can see that Africa has been carved up. Asia has been carved up. The United States wasn't too interested in Africa, but they were interested in Asia. And we also are interested in South America. So, in terms of a military motivating factor, modernization and expansion of the U.S. Navy is going to begin under Grover Cleveland and continue under Teddy Roosevelt. And there was a military theorist named Alfred Thayer Mahan who taught at the United States Naval Academy. And he wrote a book entitled The Influence of Sea Power Upon History in 1890. In essence, he said if a country wants to be powerful, they need a powerful Navy. So this heavily influenced Teddy Roosevelt as president, and so we're going to build up and modernize our Navy. Now, that's also going to require bases, which we'll talk about when we get to some of the places we acquire. The United States is also a growing industrial power. We needed markets for our industrial and agricultural goods. We needed new areas to provide raw materials. And colonies also meant international prestige and power. All these things are factoring into American interest in an overseas empire. Our intellectual drive came from the idea of progress. So people wanted to carry Western civilization and Christianity to other parts of the world. And then there was that term survival of the fittest, which we already talked about in the last presentation. Well, Westerners, Europeans, are the most fit, so therefore we should expand and bring with us Western civilization. And so this social Darwinistic idea that they called, in terms of language, the white man's burden, was carrying the flag for the United States and also for other European powers to other parts of the world. And there was a very famous poem entitled The White Man's Burden, which I put a stanza of that poem here. And so you can read that and see how this would affect people expanding into other parts of the globe from Europe, and also then by default the United States. And so social Darwinism can be very dangerous. There's a racial Darwinist component to it. And you can see this is actually a chart that was put out in 1856, types of mankind. So you can see that Western Europeans were different, and of course you have the grades of people. And this was a poster from the late 19th century. Again, Lady Liberty, the Americo-European as the highest race, and of course bringing liberty and civilization to other parts of the world. Now let's look at practical application of imperialism. So in 1867, the United States will purchase Alaska from Russia for about $7 million. This is called Seward's Folly because the Secretary of State, William H. Seward, at the time wanted Alaska. He wanted to get a bridge to the Pacific for the United States, and he wanted to keep Russia out of North America. But people didn't understand why he wanted this land. It was just a big chunk of ice, they thought, and so why were we buying this ice? So this was highly controversial at the time, even though today it's worked out quite well for the U.S. in terms of oil and other things. In 1898, the United States is going to acquire Hawaii. In the 1880s, the United States established a protectorate in Hawaii. And essentially what was happening is the United States was concerned about Japanese influence in Hawaii, so we made Hawaii a protectorate. And then because of that, they gave us Pearl Harbor. And Pearl Harbor was a natural base between China and the United States, so a refueling station. In 1893, the United States Navy will participate in the overthrow of the Hawaiian Queen. And of course, this was led by American sugar interests. There was then immediate calls for annexation to the United States, which were resisted by President Cleveland. So for a few years, you had this Hawaii in limbo. They kind of an independent country with European direction. I mean, they were independent before this, sort of. But the United States really wasn't interested in making Hawaii an official territory of the United States. That is until William McKinley was elected president in 1896. He was an expansionist, and in 1897 he worked out a treaty to annex Hawaii. And in 1898, through a joint resolution of Congress, the United States would annex Hawaii and give it territorial status. So the United States actually, or U.S. citizens actually helped overthrow the Hawaiian Queen with U.S. naval support, and that creates a climate where Hawaii becomes part of the United States. But the granddaddy of the late 19th century was the Spanish-American War of 1898. Officially, the United States declared war on Spain because of Cuba. The Cuban rebellion against Spain began in 1895, and to give you an idea of what's happening here, Spain still owns Cuba. It's one of their last colonies. And so there was a rebellion against Spanish rule. The Spanish-Cuban governor would crack down on the rebels. He would set up concentration camps. And this becomes highly unpopular in the United States. That's because there are American journalists there who are writing back in American newspapers about this. They call this yellow journalism. One of the most famous newspapers was William Randolph Hearst's The New York Journal. And this paper contained vivid accounts of the treatment of Cuban rebels in the concentration camps and the poor conditions in Cuba overall. So now the American public is sympathetic with the Cubans, and the United States starts putting pressure on Spain to reform. Spain actually would give in to U.S. demands and close the concentration camps, but this wasn't enough. So there are two events that would push the United States into war with Spain in 1898. The first is the Dulome letter, which I'll talk about in a second, and the second is the sinking of the battleship USS Maine in February of 1898. So in February of 1898, a man named Enrique Dupuy de Lome writes a letter back to Spain. He is the Spanish minister in Cuba, where he spoke very disparagingly of William McKinley. He called him a jingo and a two-bit politician. Well, this letter is intercepted and then printed in all the American newspapers, and so they think these pompous Spanish are laughing at our president. They're laughing at us, and so now there's a lot of hostility towards Spain. And then the USS Maine will be sunk in Havana Harbor just 1 week after the Lome letter is published. 260 sailors will be killed, and Spain was blamed. But did they do it? The United States was outraged. After they've done some digging and some looking at the battleship itself, they figured out this was actually an accident, that nobody really sank it, and there could have been sabotage, actually, is one of the theories. But everyone blames the Spanish. And so just a few months later, in April of 1898, Congress will declare war on Spain under the battle cry, Remember the Maine. And this will lead to a very short war, a 109-day war against Spain, which Teddy Roosevelt calls the Splendid Little War. So there is the main before she was sunk in Havana Harbor, and there it is afterwards. Interestingly enough, if you go to the Infantry Museum in Columbus, Georgia, they have a porthole from the USS Maine there. It's an interesting artifact. And of course, the propaganda machine is in full swing. Your country calls you, volunteer, join up to go fight the Spanish, go beat up the Spanish. Now, again, technically we get involved because of Cuba, but because we're going to war with Spain, the first target is not necessarily Cuba, it's the Philippines. The Philippines is also a Spanish colony, and of course, as you can see, it's right off the coast of China there, close to Hong Kong. So this would be a natural avenue to get into the Chinese trade, which is what the United States wanted to begin with. So the first target would become the Philippines. Admiral George Dewey is given instructions by Assistant Secretary of the Navy Teddy Roosevelt to attack the Philippines if war was declared, and of course war will be declared. And so Dewey would attack the Spanish fleet in May of 1898. Though he was outnumbered and outgunned, Dewey's modern warships outdueled the Spanish fleet and completely destroy it. Several months later, he would invade and occupy Manila. So now the United States has acquired the Philippines. The second target, though, becomes Cuba. The war would unfold a little more slowly here, but the question is, didn't the war begin because of Cuba? I mean, so we begin the war because of Cuba, but we take Cuba second. And so the humanitarian element here, we're going to help these poor Cubans, isn't really a factor in this. You can see the United States would blockade Cuba, also the Dominican Republic and Puerto Rico, and then we would land in June of 1898. Teddy Roosevelt makes a name for himself here because he resigns as Assistant Secretary of the Navy. He'll form a cavalry unit called the Rough Riders, and they will gain fame at the Battle of San Juan Hill. The American Navy would completely destroy the Spanish Atlantic Fleet, and there are two important victories for the United States, the Battle of Las Guasimas and the Battle of San Juan Hill. The Americans would actually lose the first, but because the Spanish run out of ammunition, they take the position, but they're victorious in the second. So here's an amphibious assault, a landing in Cuba. There's Teddy Roosevelt and the Rough Riders. There are some pictures of the soldiers, combat photograph. There were black soldiers, as we already talked about in Presentation 3 in the Spanish-American War, and there they are. So in 1898, you have the Treaty of Paris. The war would last from May to December 1898. According to the Treaty of Paris of 1898, Spain would cede Cuba, the Philippines, Guam, and Puerto Rico to the United States, and because we're such nice guys, we'll give them $20 million. The war would cost $250 million overall and almost 5,500 American lives, but only 379 of those due to combat deaths. The rest were due to disease. But now the United States has a Pacific Empire and a substantial interest in the Gulf of Mexico and the Caribbean. So there's the Philippines. There's Guam is just off the, just a little further out east of the Philippines. We also have the Hawaiian Islands. We pick up Wake Island, the Midway Islands, Johnson Island. So there's a number of areas the United States is getting here in the late 19th century to have a Pacific Empire. And of course there's Cuba and Puerto Rico, which were acquired by the Spanish-American War. Now this is an interesting poster. 1900 is an election year. And so one of the things that McKinley's going to run on is their activities there in the Spanish-American War. So the administration's promises have been kept. The American flag has not been planted in foreign soil to acquire more territory, but for humanity's sake. This is what McKinley said. But again, if that's the case, then our actions after the war don't show it. For example, the Platt Amendment of 1901, which was inserted into the Cuban Constitution, required, and in fact the United States required the Cuban people to put this in their constitution, the United States would be authorized to intervene in Cuban affairs should the United States government deem it necessary to preserve independence or preserve order. And Cuba could not make treaties with foreign governments without U.S. approval. So Cuba is a virtual protectorate. So we've acquired a colony. If it's for humanity's sake and for the independence of Cuba, you give it back. But we didn't really. And this is going to cause problems for the United States later on. McKinley also has problems with the Philippines. In fact, there's something called the Filipino-American War. 70,000 troops were used to put down an insurrection against the United States here. So the Filipino people then will rise up against the United States. So is this a war for humanity's sake or for access to China? That's the big question. And obviously, because of our actions, we want Cuba and the Philippines to have an overseas empire. So Teddy Roosevelt will become the 26th President of the United States after McKinley is assassinated in 1901. I talked about that in Presentation 8. And he will have a very aggressive foreign policy, which includes interventionism just about everywhere. he calls this big stick diplomacy. So Roosevelt's president from 1901 to 1909, and his motto was "Speak softly but carry a big stick." In fact, in 1904, he's going to issue something called the Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine was issued in 1823 by James Monroe, written by John Quincy Adams. But anyways, essentially it said that the European powers should stay out of the colonization business in Latin America. We would stay out of Europe. We have our sphere of influence. You have yours. Now, the United States couldn't enforce this. They relied on the British Navy to do it. But in 1904, essentially what Roosevelt says is, okay, we're going to use our Navy now to be the police force of the Western Hemisphere. If anyone gets out of line, we'll put them back into line. So this was an imperialistic policy towards Central, South America, the Caribbean. So the United States is going to use its Navy as a weapon to ensure that our policies are followed in the Caribbean and the Gulf of Mexico. Now, one of the jewels, of course, or one of the grand designs of the Roosevelt administration was to acquire a canal through the Isthmus of Panama. And so Amana-Plana Canal, Panama is the longest palindrome in the English language, but it's the same thing forwards and backwards. But anyways, in 1903, the United States would help Panama separate from Colombia. The Panamanian people led a revolt against Colombian rule, and then and the United States is going to help them do it. And then as soon as Panama is independent, we're given rights to the canal zone for $10 million and $250,000 annually. And so for the next 10 years, the United States is going to build the Panama Canal. And we will control the Panama Canal up until the 1990s during the Clinton administration. But this was seen as a strategic interest for the United States. We control the canal. We cut our time to get ships from the Atlantic to the Pacific in half. And so this is a major, this is a very important move for the United States. And there's an image of the Panama Canal from the Atlantic to the Pacific. But the crown jewel of the American foreign policy throughout much of this period happened to be China. I mean, this is why we went to war, partly why we went to war with the Spanish to get the Philippines. It's why James K. Polk wanted California in the 1840s. It's why we acquired Hawaii ultimately. So we want China. We want Chinese trade. And but nobody's really interested in colonizing China. So what we get is something called the open door policy. The Secretary of State, a man named John Hay, between 1898 and 1905, will work out something called the open door policy, where China will remain open to all European powers for trade. No one colonizes China. It's just open to trade. This was a major coup for the United States, because nobody carves up China, and China remains open. And we will really benefit from Chinese trade at this point. John Hay also began the process of acquiring the U.S. Virgin Islands in 1902. It was not completed until 1917, but again, we're acquiring more territory. Now, the open door policy would be challenged between 1899 and 1901 through something called the Boxer Rebellion. The United States would send about 2,000 troops for what's called the Eight-Nation Army at that point. Hay was urging the open door policy to remain in effect. But what's happening here is you have this very conservative element in China that doesn't want Western influence. And so they're going to fight to try to get Western powers out. They're not successful, but they're trying to resist Westernization. You saw this in Japan, you saw it in China, you saw it in Cuba, you saw it in the Philippines. Anywhere you have a European occupation, the native peoples there are trying to keep the Europeans out. William Howard Taft, pictured there on a buffalo, will be the military governor of the Philippines for a time. That's when that picture was taken. He would also be the Secretary of War and Governor of Cuba, but he would become president from 1909 to 1913, and he actually called the Filipino people his little brown brothers. But his foreign policy was known as dollar diplomacy. Wherever the dollar went, the United States military went, particularly in Asia and Latin America. So you can see a map of American intervention in Latin America during this time period. We're involved everywhere. Cuba, Dominican Republic, of course, the Virgin Islands, Haiti, Nicaragua, Mexico, Panama. And we're involved all over the Caribbean, and this is going to create some animosity towards the United States. Woodrow Wilson would be elected president in 1912. He serves from 1913 to 1921. Again, a very progressive foreign policy, interventionism in Latin America, and ultimately also World War I, which is the granddaddy of all the conflicts in this period of time, this early 20th century period, and which is going to involve, a large sacrifice of American men. But again, he's involved all throughout Latin America, as you can see on the map. Military intervention in Mexico. In fact, this is considered kind of the first mechanized war when we're involved there. There's a Mexican revolution. It's a communist revolution, in fact. And the United States had oil interests there that were kicked out, so the United States would get involved. But you can see that Wilson's involved all over the place. And that is a general trend of progressive foreign policy. Get involved everywhere, spread American liberty and democracy. As Wilson said later, he's going to make the world safe for democracy in World War I. That was a major tenet of progressive foreign policy. So they're doing it at home in terms of the domestic arena. They're also doing it overseas. So this, the United States government is becoming bigger in size, scope, and influence, not just at home, but also abroad. And that's drastically changing the nature of the United States government and, of course, the society in the United States. All right, well, that's it for this presentation. We'll pick up with progressives in power in the next presentation, and we'll talk more about Woodrow Wilson's domestic policy, Roosevelt's domestic policy, and Taft's domestic policy, and also some other things that are going on in that period, too. So I'll see you next time for that.